my name's Dr. Juliette Koch. I'm a fertility specialist at IVFAustralia. Welcome and thanks for being here tonight. We're going to talk about the facts about egg freezing, and I think this is a really important topic, one that has no right answers, but we're going to talk about all the pros and cons, and it's a really important discussion to be had. So I'm going to get the slides up now, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of housekeeping about how to ask questions, and then we'll start. So we are going to have time to answer questions at the end of this session, and you're welcome to post any questions as you like during the session. If you're joining us on Google Hangouts, you'll see a grid of squares on the top right of the Hangout window. Click that and then click the question and answer button. This opens up a window to the right. At the bottom of the window, click Ask a New Question, type your question, and then click Submit. If you're with us streaming live on YouTube, then you can submit your question below the video in the comments section. Just type your question in and click Post. Look, if we can't answer all of the questions tonight on the webinar, we will post you a reply to your question afterwards, so don't worry. So there has been a huge amount of media coverage around about egg freezing, and I'm sure you will have seen it. Both Apple and Facebook made announcements this year that they offer egg freezing to their female staff member as a perk. And this is really interesting and quite exciting. Our own group has extended our support to staff, and we do provide subsidised fertility treatment to our staff as one of the benefits of working with IVFAustralia. So today what we're going to talk about is egg freezing, why you might consider it, the technology that's behind it, why this option has even come about for women in the last few years, and the reality of possible success. I guess one of the reasons that egg freezing has come about is because of the way that society has changed. And what we know is that women are delaying childbearing, and this has happened for many different reasons. One is the fact that we do have access to contraception, which gives us choices, and many more women are having careers. But other reasons that people delay is the delay in finding a partner, and there are various other things that come into it. But for the very first time in 2012, the average age of a first-time mother is now over 30. And this is really quite significant, and it demonstrates the fact that people are delaying their child rearing. And in addition, the number of births to females over 40 is continuing to rise. Women are definitely having their families later, and we are continuing to see an increasing number of women inquiring about egg freezing. So the average woman in Australia having their first child is now 30 to 31. And my profession makes me acutely aware of how a woman's age impacts their fertility and what their options are. And I'm certainly talking to an increasing number of women who are inquiring about what their options are for having a family in the future. There are lots of myths out there about people's fertility and what impacts their fertility, but the most important factor is the age of the woman. And when a couple walk into my room wanting treatment for fertility, I can judge the success of the treatment based on the female age. Now, why is this? I mean, the reason is because women are born with all the eggs they'll ever have. So men are always making more sperm. So men can conceive right into their 50s, 60s, and even occasionally older than that. But women are born with all the eggs they ever have. We have the most eggs when we're 6 months in utero. We have about 4 million eggs. And by the time we're born, we've lost half of that supply. So by birth, there's 2 million eggs, and then that decreases even more until puberty. The reality is that we lose about 20 eggs per cycle. Only one of those eggs is actually released, but the other eggs die off. And, you know, by the time we're into our 40s, there's certainly a very reduced supply of eggs. The interesting thing to understand is that it doesn't matter what you do, you constantly lose eggs. So whether you're on the pill, whether you're pregnant, whatever you do, there's this constant cycle of growth and death of eggs in the ovary. This is a really powerful slide because it provides that documentation and insight into what an ovary looks like. So the slide on your left is a cut through an ovary, looking at it under the microscope. What you can see is these little follicles, which are sort of like the home for the eggs. They supply all the nutrients and have the cells in them that supply the right hormones to the egg. And on the left, you can see at birth, the ovary is packed full of follicles. By the time you're 25, the follicles are much more sparse, and by the time you're 50, there's the odd egg, but it certainly doesn't respond to hormones and certainly doesn't make a baby. This is a really good video showing you the impact of age on embryo quality. So what you're seeing here is an actual embryo undergoing fertilization and growth in the laboratory. There is a camera inside the incubator which is filming the development of the embryo. On your right, you're seeing an embryo that's now dividing, and you can see all this fragmentation. So you've got cells dividing and you've got some nice big cells, but you've also got all these small cells. Now look at the embryo on the left. This embryo on the left has nice division of cells. They're very plump, they're big, they're growing nicely, and there's no fragmentation. And what you're going to see slowly over this next few seconds to minute is that this embryo on the right is degrading. It's not developing normally, whereas the embryo on the left, which is from a younger egg, has a great amount of energy to grow and divide normally. And it's going to keep going and make more and more cells. It's at the probably day 3 stage now on the left. On the right, the embryo has stopped growing. This embryo is starting to degenerate and die, and it's not going to go on to make a pregnancy. Let's have a look again now at the embryo that is growing well. It's starting to reach compaction, which is where there are lots and lots of cells and you can't identify the individual cells. And the next stage is blastocyst development. This is the ideal stage that we want people to achieve in an IVF cycle. This is where there's a clump of cells in the middle that become the baby, and you'll start to see in a minute cells on the outside which become the placenta. So here we go. Here's the blastocyst developing. You've got cells on the outside and you've got a cavity in between, and it keeps dividing and growing. And now you can see the clump of cells on your right, that's going to become the baby. This is eventually going to hatch and implant into the uterus. So this is a beautiful quality embryo. This has about a 50% at least chance of making a baby, whereas you can see the embryo on the right has died. So this is the impact that we see of age on egg quality and embryo development. It's not all about the women. I mean, the men do have an impact. Certainly sperm is important, and you know, we know that, but egg quality and egg number is the most predictive factor in terms of the chance of a couple conceiving. We understand that women often want to delay their childbearing. They often want to do other things like study for a degree or start a career or create financial stability, make time to meet the right partner. But from a biological perspective, this graph shows you that it's best to start trying for a family before the age of 35. So how have we come to get to a point where we can freeze eggs? It all actually started with freezing embryos, and probably really started with fertility preservation for people with cancer. This is a family who were affected by cancer. This woman had breast cancer at the age of 27 and decided to freeze embryos prior to her chemotherapy. So this was a long time ago now. She stored a few embryos, and 10 years later, she decided to use them. And she now has 2 children from this technology. So the technology that's come about for embryo freezing was applied to egg freezing, but it's taken time to reach a point where this technology has reached the level where there is success with egg freezing. So in the past, egg freezing was predominantly done for medical reasons, for people facing fertility problems due to cancer, chemotherapy, surgery, etc. But now more and more people are starting to think about this as an option for what's called social egg freezing, which is considering egg freezing to preserve your fertility for the longer term in reproductive planning. A study in the UK and Denmark has showed that now 1 in 5 women are considering egg freezing as part of reproductive planning. So that's a significant number of women who are considering it, just like you, who are thinking about whether this technology could apply to them. Egg freezing has been around since the 80s, so about 30 years, but to begin with, it wasn't very successful. The reason for this is that it was done via a technique called slow freezing. Slow freezing took the egg very slowly down to sort of, minus 200 degrees. And during that stage, you would find that egg crystals would form in the egg and that this would affect the ability of the egg to survive thawing and to fertilize. In the last 5 years, we've actually figured out how to freeze eggs properly. And the technique is called vitrification. And this has really changed the landscape for egg freezing and made it a technique that's applicable and possible for women. The survival rate is much better because it's basically snap freezing the egg. You take the egg down to minus 200 degrees so quickly that it doesn't have a chance to form these ice crystals. And that snap freezing has led to much better outcomes. So the survival after thawing is now about 80%, which gives a much better chance of a pregnancy in the long term. So if you were going to consider egg freezing, I just want to take you through the basics of what's involved. The first thing is a consultation with your fertility specialist, then an orientation. You sit down with the nurse for about half an hour and you go through the injections and the treatment and what's expected of you and what you're going to need to do over the following 2 weeks. Your cycle usually begins with your period and you start hormone injections once a day for 2 weeks to stimulate the ovary. During this time, we do regular ultrasounds and blood monitoring to look at how you're responding to the hormones and adjust things accordingly. Then you need a day off work. So really during this process, you're only going to need 1 day off work, and that's for the egg collection procedure. This is done under a light anesthetic, a bit like a sedation, and it takes about 20 to 30 minutes. A needle is put into the ovary through the vagina, so there's no cuts or anything. It's done through the vagina, and the eggs are collected. The eggs are then taken up to the laboratory. The cells are removed from around the eggs, and we look to see if the eggs are mature. And we then freeze any mature eggs in liquid nitrogen. So the whole process takes about 2 weeks. So the logical next question is, well, how many eggs do I need to get to make this worthwhile? Look, the ideal scenario is that women freeze their eggs under the age of 36, 37, and that you aim to freeze at least 12 to 15 eggs. If you're older than that, you really need to freeze a lot more. And if you're older than 38 or 40, you need like a bucket full of eggs to make it worthwhile, which is why we don't generally recommend it for people over the age of 37, 38. Most women want to freeze about 20 eggs. And for most people, that will mean doing 2 cycles of IVF because you can, on average, get about 10 to 12 eggs from 1 cycle. So most people will need to do 2 cycles to have enough eggs to make this a worthwhile process. So to understand what's going to happen to the eggs, it's important to understand that there's a natural attrition rate. So if you had 10 eggs frozen, when we thaw them out, about 8 or 9 will survive the process of thawing. And then we've got to put the sperm from your partner into the eggs. So that's done through a process called ICSI, where the sperm is injected into the eggs. And then about, 3, 4, 5 embryos will fertilize. And then over the next few days, we'll watch the embryo grow, just like we saw in that dish on that video. And we'll be aiming to sort of have, a couple of good embryos at the end of that process. Each embryo, depending on your age, might give you about a 30 to 40% chance of a live birth. So what about the costs? Egg freezing is expensive, that's a given, but IVFAustralia have made it very clear and easy to understand the costs. And what's important to understand is that for women who are freezing eggs where there's no medical problem, like they don't have a cancer or an immediate risk to their fertility, then egg freezing is not covered by Medicare. So the upfront cost really is around that $10,000, $11,000 mark when you look at the total costs, including the day surgery. And you do have ongoing storage fees of about $500 per year. So I guess it all sounds sort of easy, but it's important to understand that it's not straightforward, and it is quite a complex issue, the issue of egg freezing. If you talk about it with the general public, you're going to hear lots of different ideas about whether it's a good thing to do or not a good thing to do. And, that takes into account some of the risks associated with it, the cost, but also, there's concerns about egg freezing. Does it make people have unrealistic expectations? Does it give you false hope? Does it make you delay child rearing where you really shouldn't do that? So there are lots of people out there who are against egg freezing because they're saying that it gives women, delay, it sort of gives them false hope. But it's really important to understand what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the reality of its success. there's not a lot of long-term data available about egg freezing. So we know that the children that have been born in the last sort of 4 to 5 years, and there have been about a few thousand babies born across the world. So these children are now 5 years of age. We don't have long-term data, but the data that we have is very reassuring. It's important that we continue to collect that data, and we will continue to do so. There are also implications for having children at an older age. So if you're egg freezing at 35 because you want to delay till you're 40, there are going to be implications for you and your family about delaying childbearing to that age. So there's an increased risk of pregnancy when you're in your late 30s. There's increased blood pressure problems, diabetes, etc. So, you know, that's important to understand as well. There may be issues for children in being born to older parents as well, and that, you know, can be perceived differently by different people, but it's certainly not clear cut. And I think that's why we're having this conversation tonight, and why it's really important for you to have your questions answered, because there's no right or wrong answer to egg freezing. It's not right for everyone, and it needs to be assessed on an individual basis. So tonight we've talked a bit about the impact of age. I think I've, you know, talked about the fact that age has a big impact on fertility, and that might mean that some of you listening might be disappointed to hear that egg freezing is not an option for you. For example, if you're 40 or 41, it's not something that I would recommend. And that could be quite disappointing. And I guess I just want to say one quick thing to say that for people where egg freezing is not an option, it may be that you might consider actually having a family of your own now, rather than freezing eggs. And if you don't have a partner, that might involve our donor sperm program. So we do have a very comprehensive program, and you can access information for that, about that, on our website. So I'd love to answer any of your questions, and I'll do so. I'm just looking at the questions that you've asked. So one of the questions is how successful is egg freezing? So a lot of the data about egg freezing comes out of Spain, because they have a very big egg bank and they use it for donor eggs. So in Australia, the people doing egg freezing are not young donors. They tend to be people in their 30s. But the data that comes out of Spain and America on egg freezing shows that the success with frozen eggs is almost equivalent to fresh eggs. But what you've got to remember is that that data comes out of people in their 20s. So we can't apply that to the group of people doing egg freezing in Australia, because they tend to be 35 plus. So far, what we find is that it's not quite as successful as fresh eggs, but certainly once they thaw and survive, they are as successful as fresh eggs. What we say is that it's about a 5% chance of a pregnancy per egg. So again, that's where the numbers of sort of 15, 20 eggs come from. So we recommend that you need about 15 to 20 eggs to have about a 50% chance of success. One of the other questions I've received is, how long do stored eggs last? The good news about that is that they last pretty much forever. When you sign a consent form, you're consenting to 5 years of storage, but there's no reason that eggs can't survive longer. We are starting to freeze eggs in young girls, like sometimes girls of sort of 16, 17 who are undergoing chemotherapy. We consider egg freezing in those people, and they will be storing for probably 10, 15, 20 years. And there's no evidence to suggest that that's detrimental to eggs. Another question I've received is, if I have irregular periods, can I still freeze my eggs? And definitely you can. Part of the workup that you would go through is to work out why your periods are irregular. There are a couple of possibilities. One is you've got polycystic ovaries and you don't ovulate regularly, and you're an ideal person for egg freezing because you should get really good egg numbers from a cycle of IVF. The other reason you could have irregular periods is if you have a real fertility issue, like you might be running out of eggs, in fact, or you might have endometriosis or something else that's affecting your fertility. And that's really important to find out. So if you do have a problem with your fertility, egg freezing may be covered by Medicare. So that's really important, and you need to see a fertility specialist. So the next question is, can I know in advance if the eggs will survive the process? No, it's not possible to know that in advance. What's all we can tell you is what the statistics show across a group of women, which shows about an 80% survival. But if the eggs are really poor quality, then the survival rate could be even lower than that. And again, if eggs are very good quality, then we could have better survival rates. So it is very much an individual thing, and something that we can't really predict in advance. So if you have any other questions, certainly post them on the site. We'd love to get back to you, and we'll get back to you by tomorrow with some answers. But I hope you've enjoyed it. I think this is an important topic, something to talk about with your friends, with your family, and keep thinking about. And we'd love to see you if you have any further questions. All the best.